He gave a freezing Apache boy a blanket, and the town turned on him, calling it betrayal. Sheriff McCain, driven by old grudges, made it clear that no help would come if trouble followed. But fate had its own answer. At sunrise, 350 horses lined his fence in silent gratitude. And just wait until you hear how this act of kindness turned everything upside down, and why justice, in the end, came riding back stronger than ever. The wind that night carried a bite sharp enough to split skin. Cold like that didn't belong in the desert, but this winter had broken all rules. Beneath a sky full of stars over the New Mexico plains, the ground crunched under hooves as Jacob Holt rode back toward his ranch. He wore his old duster, hat pulled low, a thick blanket wrapped tight across his shoulders. The cattle were settled. The fences were still holding, another day behind him. He wasn't a man who looked for stories. Life had already written too many in the lines across his face. Ranch work, loss, quiet grief. He kept his hands calloused and his thoughts to himself. But that night, fate had other plans. As Jacob rounded a bend near the dry creek bed, something pulled his gaze. Movement where none should be. A small shape, huddled against the brush, barely visible beneath the moonlight. He slowed his horse, the crunch of frost-covered grass beneath hooves the only sound. It was a child, a boy no older than 10, thin, silent, shoulders drawn in as if trying to disappear. His dark eyes looked up, not in fear, but with the dullness of someone too cold to care anymore. He wasn't wearing nearly enough, just a worn-out shirt, torn at the sleeve, dust-covered pants. His skin was bronze, unmistakably Apache. That fact alone would have been enough for most men in the territory to ride past without a second thought, maybe even spit. But Jacob didn't ride past. He stayed in the saddle for a long moment, staring at the boy. The silence between them stretched like barbed wire. Finally, Jacob dismounted. He didn't speak at first, didn't ask questions. He just unwrapped the thick wool blanket from around his own shoulders and knelt down slowly. "Take it," he said, voice low. The boy didn't move. He watched the man's hands, the blanket, the horse behind him. Then he reached out, slow, hesitant, like someone who'd been burned before by what seemed kind. Jacob waited until the boy pulled the blanket around himself. Then he nodded once, got back on his horse, and rode off. He didn't know the boy's name, didn't ask where he came from, but he felt it deep in his bones, the kind of cold that wasn't just weather, the kind that settled into a soul. That night, inside the ranch house, Jacob didn't light the fire right away. He just stood at the window for a long time, listening to the wind and wondering what kind of world left a child out in the dark like that. The next morning, word had already reached town. Jacob Holt gave a blanket to an Apache boy. In a place where grudges ran deeper than wells, that was all it took to light another kind of fire. By morning, the story had traveled farther than dust on a prairie wind. In a town like Del Rio, news didn't need a newspaper. It moved through front porches, blacksmith shops, and quiet whispers in church pews. By midday, it reached the ear of Sheriff Randall McCain. McCain wasn't a man easily rattled. Tall, stone-faced, and known for keeping order with a stare as sharp as any badge. He lived through ambushes, cattle rustling, and the kind of land feuds that stretched across generations. But the moment he heard what Jacob Holt had done, his grip on the coffee tin cracked. He stepped out of the sheriff's office, still holding the dented mug, and made straight for the saloon. The doors banged open behind him like a clap of thunder. Inside, the regulars stopped talking. "You all here?" he said to no one in particular. Holt gave a blanket to a stray Apache kid, just handed it over like he was kin. Someone muttered, maybe the boy needed help. McCain's eyes narrowed. They always need something, until they take more. You think this ends with one blanket? He didn't wait for a reply. By sundown, he was in the saddle, riding out with 3 deputies. The trail to Holt's ranch twisted along the canyon rim, lined with brittle sagebrush and wind-blown silence. When they arrived, Jacob was working by the barn, hammering a loose fence rail back into place. He looked up, calm as ever, as the riders dismounted. Dust clung to their boots, and tension hung thick in the air. "You got something to say, Randall?" Jacob asked, setting down the hammer. McCain stepped forward, jaw tight. "I do. That boy you gave shelter to, he's part of a people who've taken from us. You think handing him wool makes you better than the rest of us? Jacob didn't flinch. I didn't hand him wool, he said evenly. I handed him warmth. He was freezing. McCain's voice dropped, heavy with warning. They'll take that kindness as weakness. Next time they come, they'll be carrying more than frostbite, and don't expect the town to ride with you when they do. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Behind them, the wind rustled dry grass. A hawk circled overhead. I didn't ask for backup, Jacob finally said, and I didn't ask permission. McCain turned on his heel without another word. The other riders followed, but not before glancing back once, uncertain, caught between loyalty and doubt. As the hoofbeats faded into the dusk, Jacob stood alone by the fence. He knew what the sheriff feared. Maybe he feared it too. But fear wasn't what had driven him to give the boy that blanket. It was something older, something steadier. He looked to the horizon, where the sun was slipping behind the distant ridges. The land felt colder now, not from winter, but from something creeping beneath the surface. Mistrust, suspicion, the old weight of division. And still, Jacob stayed, because the truth of that moment, that single act of decency, was something no threat could undo, even if it meant standing alone, especially then. The days that followed were quieter than they should have been, too quiet for a ranch that size. No deliveries came up the road. The feed store closed its doors when Jacob walked by. Even the telegraph clerk looked the other way when he passed. But Jacob Holt didn't ask for pity. He rose with the sun, saddled his gelding, and checked his fences the same as always. The ranch hands were gone. Some quit, others just stopped showing up, but he kept working. He knew the land better than anyone. It had raised him and buried the ones he loved. If he had to run it alone, so be it. Inside the barn, where tools once clattered and men's voices filled the air, there was only the soft breathing of the horses and the scrape of hay being thrown into troughs. He talked to them sometimes, not with words, just with presence, with steady hands and a kind of patience that didn't ask for thanks. Nights were colder. He let the fire burn low. When sleep came, it brought restless images. A small boy wrapped in wool sitting near the hearth, eyes watching the flames like they might vanish if he blinked. One evening, as dusk bled across the hills, a shape appeared at the edge of Jacob's property. A single rider, quiet, steady, moving through the mesquite like a shadow. Jacob stepped off his porch, hand resting casually near the rifle leaning by the door, not out of fear, but out of habit. The rider dismounted. An elder. Long braids threaded with faded red cloth, face weathered by wind and sun. His coat was worn, but his posture was proud. He said nothing for a moment, just studied Jacob the way a man studies a tree before leaning against it. Then, in slow and careful English, he spoke. "You gave warmth to my daughter's son," he said. "We know what that cost you." Jacob didn't answer right away. He looked at the man, not just his face, but his eyes, steady, tired, alert. "I didn't do it for anything in return," Jacob finally said. The elder nodded. "That's why it matters." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle, a piece of cloth tied at the corners. Inside, dried meat, roots, and something wrapped in deer hide. "He sleeps under that blanket now," the elder said. "He wakes without shaking." Jacob accepted the gift with both hands, the way you'd accept anything that came from a place deeper than obligation. The elder turned to leave, but paused after a few steps. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will see what your kindness has done." Then he mounted his horse and rode off into the twilight, vanishing as quietly as he came. Jacob stood alone in the fading light, the bundle still warm in his hands. He didn't know what the man meant, not yet. But as he looked out across the open land, a strange feeling stirred in his chest. Not fear, not pride, but something in between. A stillness before something greater. And for the first time in days, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full, like the air was holding its breath. The night passed without a sound. No coyotes howled. No wind swept across the grass. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from peace. It came from waiting. Even the horses in the stable sensed it. They shifted less. Breathing slowed, as if they too were holding still for something unseen. Before the first light touched the hills, Jacob Holt was already awake. He stood at the edge of his porch, coffee cooling in his hands, his eyes on the horizon. He didn't know what to expect, if anything. Maybe the elder's words had been ceremonial, a gesture, a farewell. Then, just as the sky broke from deep blue to silver, movement flickered in the distance. It started as a shimmer, like heat rising from the ground. But there was no heat, only frost on the fence rails and a hush in the air. The shimmer took form. Hooves. Dozens at first, then hundreds. They came not as a charge, but as a procession. Slow, deliberate, purposeful. Riders in long coats and woven blankets. Faces marked with age or with youth. Horses of every color. Painted, black, golden, and ash gray. Saddles carved by hand. Some riders had bows across their backs. Others held nothing but quiet dignity. Jacob stepped down from the porch. They formed a line along the length of his fence. From one edge of the pasture to the other, the horses stood side by side, 350 strong, not tethered, not bound. Each one held in place by the calm control of its rider. From the center of the line, the elder from the night before rode forward. Jacob didn't speak. Neither did the elder at first. They stood facing each other as the sky turned gold behind them. Then the elder said, "Each one is a gift. A thank you. From every family touched by your choice." Jacob's brow furrowed. "That's more than a thank you. That's your livelihood." The elder nodded. "It is. But so is the life of a boy, nearly lost to cold. So is the message sent when a man sees beyond blood and history." Jacob looked down the long line. Horses breathing in the morning chill, eyes calm, riders still. He felt the weight of it, not just the gift, but what it meant. An entire people had come forward, not with weapons, not with demands, but with the most valuable thing they had, trust. "I didn't expect this," Jacob said, voice low. The elder's face softened, and for the first time, a faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Neither did we, but your fire that night lit more than a hearth. It lit something we thought was gone." A breeze passed through then, light, gentle, moving through the line of horses like a current. Not a single one broke formation, not a sound from the riders, just silence, full of meaning. As the sun cleared the ridge, its light spilled across the land, setting every saddle and mane aglow. Jacob stood motionless, feeling the warmth on his face, the stillness around him, no longer cold, but complete. The morning had spoken, and what it said would be remembered. The sun rose slow and clear, touching every fence post, every tree limb, every stirrup in the line of horses, still standing quietly along Jacob Holt's property. For a few minutes longer, the ranch seemed to exist outside of time, caught between past and future, between silence and change. Jacob didn't speak. He simply stood among them, one man surrounded by a gesture too large for words. Each of the Apache riders remained still, not out of duty, but out of respect. The moment wasn't for ceremony. It was for recognition of what had been given and what had been returned. When the last beam of dawn had washed over the hills, the riders turned their horses, one by one, and rode away. No commands, no signals, just instinct and unity, like leaves lifted by wind. In minutes, the field was empty. But the horses remained. 350 heads, everyone carefully tied or released in the pastures. Jacob walked among them slowly, hands brushing their necks, reading their calm, as if it were ink on a page. Each one had been chosen. Each one meant something. By the time the townspeople arrived, word had already spread. They came on wagons and horseback, some curious, others skeptical. And when they saw the sea of horses stretching across Holt's ranch, their voices fell away. No one had ever seen anything like it. The sheriff came last. Randall McCain rode in with a frown, settled deep into his features, but even he couldn't hide the shift in his eyes. He stopped a few yards from Jacob, studying the field. "You didn't ask for this," he said. "No," Jacob replied, "but they gave it anyway." McCain dismounted slowly, dust rising around his boots. For a long moment he said nothing, then glanced back at the road behind him, where half the town stood watching. "I thought they'd come in anger," he admitted. "Guess I was wrong." Jacob nodded. "You weren't the only one." A boy ran through the grass then, no older than the one Jacob had found days earlier. He darted between the horses, laughing, followed by others. What began as quiet curiosity turned into something else: warmth, wonder, a kind of peace no one had expected. People didn't just leave that day with stories. They left different. Jacob never sold those horses. He tended them, shared them, let children learn to ride on them. Some say he gave every one of them a name. Others say he didn't need to. He remembered them by the eyes. Years later, a wooden sign was nailed to the entrance of Holt Ranch, weather-worn, but still legible. 350 horses for a single blanket. Kindness always returns, only louder. And for generations, whenever the wind shifted over that patch of land, it carried more than dust. It carried the sound of hooves and the memory of the morning when silence became legacy.